Welcome back students to lecture 14 of the course on Sociology of Media and Communication. So, I am going to continue with our discussion on the interactionist approach, which is drawn from John Thompson's work, and in today's lecture we are going to take it ahead from what we were discussing of interaction and going back to the medium of television, where we have to also think about how in television, which is a mediated quasi kind of interaction, producers typically orient their behavior towards recipients even though they are not physically present. So, although they may not be physically present, producers, when they are creating content, they are constantly keeping in mind how it will be received. For instance, in the preparation of these lectures, my most direct target is you, the learners, the students. So, therefore, the expectation that I have is that what I am trying to say is communicated to you. So, the recipients are very, very important even when they are not physically present. The recipient orientation of producers' behavior is also basically constitutive of the action itself, primarily because when I am creating content as a television producer of a serial or any other program, the idea is that it should be received well, and the action that it should generate is that they continue watching and that there is discussion about it. Essentially, the idea that the recipients are the most important, although they may not be physically present. So, again today we are going to talk about 4 forms of acting for distant others. So, these distant others are actually the recipients who are not visible, and there are 4 ways in which one can act towards them. So, the recipient address is that in the first form, most straightforward type, which is direct or indirect, that there could be direct action, there could be indirect action. What is direct action? In this, producers facing camera and speak to it so that viewers have the impression of being spoken to. So, in these forms of programs, the viewers are directly spoken to. For instance, let us say in a news bulletin, the anchor directly speaks to the audience and the audience get to be sort of spoken to. In reading of the news is a routine form of direct recipient address, like I addressed. The indirect recipients is actually when front region of the production sphere becomes a site for face to face interaction among producers and indirectly addresses a range of absent recipients. For instance, a panel discussion or a chat show. They are different from the news bulletin, because in the news bulletin you are being directly addressed as the recipient, whereas in a panel discussion or a chat show, in the front region there are discussions happening. So, the panelists talk to each other and the content is being directed to the viewers. So, the moderator will keep saying in between that we would like to know, we would like to let our viewers know that this is what is being discussed, or we would like to let our viewers know that you can call on this number, etc. So, what you have is, in that sense, a direct way of acting towards the recipients and an indirect way. The televised interview is a face-to-face interaction that takes place in the front region of a mediated quasi-interaction, and part of the art of skillful interviewing is to know how to combine effectively the action orientations relevant to each. What this means is that when there are television interviews which are being televised, they are again a part of face-to-face interaction which happens in the front region in a mediated quasi-interaction medium like the television, but it is also indirectly addressed to the recipients, right. What you notice again is an interaction mix. You see a combination of forms of interaction. In mediated everyday activity, what you have is that these are part of or presented as part of the actual flow of conduct in day-to-day life. What it means is that a mediated activity like a telephone call, it is a part of your everyday life. If you are working in a corporate job, if you have Zoom meetings every day, these are mediated activities, they are a part of your everyday life. Front region of the production sphere is the setting for a series of actions or interactions which are part of the everyday life of the individual. So, the front region is part of the everyday life of individuals, for instance the Zoom meetings, but filming of these actions or interactions and then transmission to a range of absent recipients, it may actually affect the nature of the action or interaction itself as well as its subsequent course. What this means is that in many ways the filming is also happening in multiple ways with an absent recipient targeted, and this absent recipient could be many. This recording of courses in the NPTEL platform is also an example of that, because we do not really know who is enrolling, who is listening, etc. But the idea is that we are recording it, we are preparing it with a range of recipients as target. Now, involving indirect recipient address. When is the recipient indirect? When action occurs where individuals pursue their day-to-day conduct while knowing that they may be recorded and transmitted. So, it means that in this kind of behavior, the recipients are aware of them being recorded or where they might be surveilled, but they are also indirectly in that space. What does this mean, right? It primarily means that let us think about an action like a CCTV monitoring on the streets, etc. That is also the possibility of media where the recipient addresses are indirect, primarily because not anybody is sure in terms of who is being monitored, but everybody is also being monitored. So, what you have is that your behavior is oriented towards behaving in a particular way, because you are under monitoring or surveillance, but at the same time you are not the direct target. So, there is again a sense of how interaction in that case is quasi mediated. You have the CCTV which is working with technology, and there is no possibility of face to face or direct communication. There is monitoring, people behave in a particular way. For instance, let us say there is a CCTV in a mall, even if somebody wants to shoplift, they will not, because they know there are cameras watching them, but it is not specifically targeted to a direct individual. So, most of these everyday activities actually are also simulated in the sense that individuals pretend to engage in ordinary action or interaction, and this is done for the purpose of being filmed or creating a televisable event. Now, this is a particular way of understanding quasi mediated interaction where it is not fiction. So, this is not content which is part of fiction, and the individuals who are involved in producing simulated everyday activity, they cannot give any indication that their action is not real. For instance, the example of this could be reality TV shows. In reality TV shows, the understanding is that what you are watching actually is real, but in many ways it may not also be real, but definitely it is not seen as a television serial, which is why it is called a reality show. So, what you also have is, when we are thinking about these action, interaction and recipients, you have multiple forms of actions, interactions and recipients. One can see that some recipients are directly targeted and some recipients are indirectly targeted. In face to face interaction, most recipients are directly targeted. So, if I had a classroom full of students sitting in front of me, I know that I am targeting maybe 30 students or 40 students or 50 students, and I know them personally. Whereas, in this kind of an address, the recipients are indirect, where I do not exactly know who and how many and from where are they listening. So, what happens is that the style of interaction is also rooted in the style of the recipient. Now, what I want to now focus on is acting for distant others. So, when we think about interaction and communication, as the history suggests, the initial years of or centuries of communication have primarily meant for face to face interaction, where the audience and who is communicating, they are all there. This acting or interacting for distant others is a relatively new phenomena, which is the product of also mass communication. So, the development of communication media that gave rise to new kinds of action at a distance, where you are communicating with the hope that others who are not in your physical vicinity understand you. New kind of action oriented or responsive to actions or people who are situated in spatially, temporally remote contexts. So, you break geographical, regional, time barriers. A whole range of technological innovations have extended the reach of human action in space and time, but the development of communication media has also created new kinds of action at a distance, which may have distinctive characteristics. So, these actions for distant others are also rooted in the way in how messages are communicated to the whole world using electronic or technological medium, where one is not really sure who the audience is. Now, number of ways in which we can understand this action at distance. One is, first let us talk about media events. Now, what are these media events? As you know, they are exceptional events which are planned in advance, they are broadcasted live and they interrupt the normal flow of events. They are very carefully pre-planned and rehearsed, they are organized by institutions, they involve media institutions and they are announced well in advance. In most cases, the examples could be state funerals, major sporting events, etc. What are these events? These events are actually targeted for most people possible, maximum people possible in the world, and it is an action at distance, primarily because by no means is it face to face interaction. So, the individuals participating in these events must concentrate on what they are doing in the specific locales in which they are acting. They know that their actions are part of events which have a much broader significance. So, they may be competing in the Olympics and they know what that means, but when it is broadcasted and telecasted to the remotest corners of the world, they know that their very local act will have a global kind of significance, and they are being broadcast and endowed with the character of an exceptional event, and we like watching these events as audiences. The Oscar award ceremony, the Globe award ceremony for instance, the way that people will wake up in the morning in Indian Standard Time and watch these events, they signify what these exceptional media events amplify in terms of acting at a distance for others. The second is the fictionalized action, where there is a fully scripted story constructed and acted out by individuals who know that they are acting and who are also generally perceived as such by absent recipients. In this case, again, acting in a way that is very similar in theatre, where you play a part, you speak the words of a character and also portray, but whom they know to be something other than themselves. So, here the people who are acting, they have a very clear front versus backstage kind of distinction. They know that what they are doing is acting, performing, fictionalizing action, but the audience is also engaged in that. But it also differs from theatre in exactly the way that mediated quasi interaction differs from face to face interaction. Primarily because in theatre the audience is live, whereas in quasi mediated interaction it is not. It is action for distant others and hence it lacks the presence of an audience and the kinds of recipient response that you would have in a play, like laughter, clapping, crying, etc., which again is missing in the quasi mediated. Programs that explicitly blur the boundaries between fiction and non-fiction, such as drama documentaries which use actors and also a partly fictionalized plot to tell a story which is allegedly real. we were discussing crime shows, etc., true crime shows, and the basically popularity of those, and they are rooted in how they manage to blur the distinction between reality and non-reality. So, fictionalized action is another acting at distance and for distant others. Now, let us talk about responsive action in distant context. Now, these responsive actions actually take place in contexts which are far removed from the context of production. So, the spatial temporal context of these receptions do not overlap with that of production, and multiple reception contexts exist which may not overlap with one another. For instance, in the case of television, the primary reception region is often a particular room in a private domestic residence, and it is this residence, room, house, the space which is watching the television content, but it is produced for an indefinite range of recipients, and the different reception contexts may share certain characteristics which depend on the nature of the technical medium deployed. What you also have is that the context of production is very different from the context of reception. Then, in responding to the actions or utterances of producers, recipients generally contribute to other interactions which they are a part of. For instance, they may be actually discussing a television show and create a fan group out of that. Discursive elaboration, where media messages are elaborated, reflected, refined, criticized, praised and commented on by recipients. Today, if you see digital media, this has actually been taken to a very different phase. For instance, there are people, influencers, YouTube personalities who might be commenting on content created on these very platforms by others. What is happening is that there is this discursive elaboration, where the media messages become the subject matter of discussions among its recipients. So, you may have television news doing a segment on what has happened on X. So, the idea of these media messages is that they acquire an additional audience who are also secondary recipients who may have not participated in the original kind of interaction, but then they also know what is happening through those secondary means. For instance, let us say I do not have an X account, but I watch the television and I get to know that there was a fight amongst two film stars on X. I am a secondary recipient getting to know about what is happening on X through the television. So, here in this case, I am part of the mediated quasi interaction television news audience, but I may not have the X account. So, I do not have a digital kind of interaction possible. But then once I watch the television news, I know what had happened, I go and talk about it in a face-to-face interaction. So, you can see the chain of interaction and communication that one is a part of. Extended mediazation, which means that the media messages which are taken up by media organizations and incorporated into new media messages. So, what I just said of a TV program on X content would primarily be extended mediazation, where media messages are taken up and then relayed. Relatively high degree of self-referentiality within the media. It again means that media ecosystems work within that by basically talking about each other's content. So, television talks about X, YouTube personalities talk about Instagram influencers, etc. So, you have that extended kind of mediation, where you have these media messages being relayed and with the perspective of referring to each other. So, what we also have is that there is an appropriation of media messages, primarily which begins with the initial reception of the media messages, but then extends well beyond it, involving other contexts. As you can see, other social contexts are also involved, other individuals, etc. So, if there is an kind of fight between two film personalities, you may have questions posed to others who are then asked to give their opinions. That becomes an extended mediation, and these appropriations are dependent on the content, the discursive elaboration of the messages amongst recipients, and social attributes of the individuals who receive them. So, you have this discussion amongst people, and the appropriation which is rooted in those three characteristics. Now, these are also ways of acting in response to others who are temporally and spatially remote. You may have seen that certain celebrities, film stars, television stars, they may give certain kind of clarifications through their social media channels. Who is the audience of that clarification? That audience in fact is these distant others who are being targeted because they may have been engaged in those appropriation of media messages and the extended mediation by talking about it, which is why it is felt that then they need a clarification. So, what we see is that individuals in a set of activities like watching, listening, reading, discussing are stimulated by the action of others who may not be in their physical presence, and responsive activities unfold in ways that are varied and unrelated to one another, reflecting the diversity of the context in which these messages are received. Now, when we think about responsive action, recipients may respond in ways that are similar and that may even be explicitly coordinated or by a relatively independent agency operating within the context of reception. So, in one way, how recipients respond is something which producers try to predict and act accordingly, but it could also be that how they respond is very different from how producers expect. This is when, let us say, a film is being made or a television serial being made and it does not do well in the box office or as per the TRP ratings. Here, the responsive action of the recipient may have been very different from the one that was predicted. So, individuals react in similar ways to mediated actions, utterances or events, although individuals are situated in diverse contexts and there is no communication or coordination between them. This means that in most cases, when we think about recipients, individuals, they react according to their primarily socio-cultural context. So, when we see certain content in the media doing very well, it is also a reflection of how the producer of that content has been able to target the socio-cultural sensibilities. So, when individuals respond in similar ways to symbolic devices, the importance of devices stems from the peculiar nature of the mediated quasi-interaction. These intended mechanisms for the coordination of recipient response means that the producers employ a range of symbolic devices which aim to elicit similar responses. For instance, if a film shows a cute puppy and a child playing together, that will elicit a very similar response of the audiences liking that, because it shows something in which the action, the response is also being rooted on how those two images of a child and a puppy come together. Action which requires some degree of organization and coordination within the context of reception means that forms of collective action stimulated and nourished by mediated images, actions and utterances. In this case, the producers have to prepare a little, they have to coordinate the action. And it could vary from diffuse clusters of individuals acting in similarly or partly convergent ways two well organized social movements with clearly articulated goals on the other. So, if there are actions which require organization and coordination, here again it is possible to create mediated images, actions and utterances together to provoke certain responses. So, if somebody is creating a documentary on raising awareness about a social issue, they would put in images which would provoke a response which needs to be coordinated. So, in the Vietnam War, the example that Thompson uses, one could see vivid coverage of the war which was partially responsible for the strength generated to basically create an anti-war movement. It was also the first major American military involvement overseas which was covered in detail by television. This is an important point because the television here then plays a role. Mediated images and information had the potential to stimulate forms of responsive action. So, when Americans saw that there were soldiers dying, people dying, they felt that they needed to protest against their government, and the images played a huge role, where then they finally put pressure on the government to stop the war. A very similar kind of experience was had in the 9/11 attack in the US, where those images had been replayed again and again on television, and it created a sense of response which was from most people in the world that it was not okay, it was devastating. Development of communication media, especially television, introduced a very fundamental element into this social and political life, where by providing individuals with images and information about events that take place in locales far beyond our immediate social milieu, the media is able to stimulate or actually install forms of collective action which may be very difficult to control within established mechanisms of power. So, the 9/11 images are very crucial, and I can give this example to illustrate how those images generated feelings of emotions in not only just Americans, but also others in terms of how they felt the pain of those attacks. So, one can see that the television images particularly play a big role in how you think about events that are not part of your active or your immediate social world. What then we have with the interactionist approach telling us that we have shifted from face to face to mediated to quasi, where media is very actively involved in constituting the social world. In a way, the social world is not only our own geography anymore. Media shapes and influences the course of events and create events that would not have existed in their absence. By controlling the flow of images and information, the media also plays a role in controlling the flow of events. Again, very important, where the media sort of directs how people behave. There have also been several instances of media trials now, where cases and how they should be handled are discussed in the media even before they reach the judiciary. So, what happens is that the media directs the flow of events and makes us think about what should be done before the law or the judiciary can get involved. So, this mediated field of interaction is a field in which relations of power, they shift very quickly, dramatically, and also in unpredictable ways. And these fields of interaction are actually global in scale, and the pace of social change can only be accelerated by the speed of how information flows. So, we are in a world where now globalization is not only about goods, people, it is also about ideas and information, and we have new kinds of interconnectedness and interdeterminacy in this modern contemporary mediatized world. This mediatized world sort of takes us on a journey of understanding interaction from the very traditional physical face to face to also looking at mediated and quasi mediated interaction, where the primary action now is not oriented towards a very specific targeted group of individuals, but it is actually to distant others, where the responses, the recipients will be from people who are living in many distant corners from you. So, with this we come to an end of the interactionist approach, and in the next lecture we will take up another theoretical approach to understand media and communication. Thank you.